I've known Andrew for an awful long time now, so I actually asked him how to introduce him, because I've known too much about Meander forever. But Andrew's the president of a game design company called Quixotic Games that has been making games since 2013. He works with me and Catherine, 2003, excuse me. He works with me and Catherine and about 14 other developers. We've made 18 games now, 18 games have been published. He's also an instructor here and at Raritan Valley Community College for the last few years, teaching game design. Here as part of an English course, writing, collaborative writing, and a few different courses at RBCC, right?
Right, as part of the computer science department.
Computer science then, okay. So, Andrew Parks.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much for having me here today. As Mike mentioned, I'm the president of Quixotic Games, and we have been making board games and card games for the past 10 years. Usually when I introduce and say I make games, everyone always assumes that it's video games. But it's actually board games and card games that we've been working on. From 1998 to 2003, I was trying to break into this industry. I was really struggling. I was meeting publishers who were shaking my hand and telling me, yes, we're going to publish your game, and then they went out of business. Or something else like that would happen. Or they would want to do the game and then decide, oh, we can't afford to do the game. So I was struggling quite a bit during those 5 years. And during that time as well, I was home raising my two daughters, Sarah and Julia. So I've got sort of a unique perspective from them on education and games, because with me as a stay-at-home dad, they had to play a lot of games because I liked games, and so I made sure that they would also. So then from 2003 to 2013, we had some games published, and we've now actually had the opportunity to have 18 games published. Some of the games are original concepts. Some of the games have been based upon major licenses like Star Trek, The Hunger Games, Harry Potter. So we've had a lot of opportunities. Let me just move this forward here. Oh, there we go. So those are a few of our games. We've had the opportunities to work with a lot of different people and to approach games from a lot of different angles. So this topic that I want to talk about today, which is motivating people to learn through games, is something that I've been thinking about for a long time. And it's based upon really the start of how I got my first game published. I'm going to give you a little bit of backstory, if you don't mind, about how my first game ended up getting published, because it had to do with a different understanding that I acquired of what games could be and what they could mean. So the story begins in 2001, when I was still struggling to get published. And in September of 2001, I found myself, like a lot of other people, realizing that I didn't really understand a lot about the world. That things were going on around me, and I just felt completely blindsided. So, you know, in September and October, there were a lot of documentaries that were being very quickly created by the History Channel and everything else, trying to explain to us what was going on in the world that we hadn't really been aware of. And I found those interesting, those documentaries, but I felt like I was an outsider looking in, that I wasn't really a part of that story. And so I used the only tool I had to try to explore a little bit about, maybe for the past 100 years, how our society has been defined, how world events have been defined. So I said, I'm gonna make a game with no intention of trying to get it published whatsoever, just so that I could sort of do an exercise. At the time, the game that I was trying to get published was called Camelot Legends. This is a card from the game. And this was a game about fantasy, and it was a game about magic, and it was completely not helpful to me during a time when I felt like the real world was kind of insecure and possibly unsafe and difficult to understand. So I started doing research, and I created a game. And ironically, even though for 5 years I had been trying to get all of these other games published by going to conventions and banging on publishers' doors, the first game that I had published ended up being this game, this side project I had worked on, because a publisher found out about it and wanted to publish the game. So this game ultimately was Ideology, the War of Ideas. And in this game, each player represented a different ideology from the 20th century. So there was imperialism, capitalism, communism, fascism, and Islamic fundamentalism. And the game was abstract. It didn't try to center on any particular events. It didn't make any judgments or show any favoritism towards any of the different ideologies or show any condemnation towards any ideology. What it did was it looked at world events not from the perspective of countries, but from the perspective of different ideas and how different ideas influence the world. So in the game, one of the things that I discovered through my research was that different ideas influence the world through military influence, economic influence, and cultural influence. But as you can see, those cards were very basic, very abstract. They made no interpretation as to what was going on in the world, just showing how each different ideology had a special power and how you would try to influence the world using these different powers. So as this game got published, I was very scared because it was kind of a controversial topic. And I would bring it to game conventions. I would watch people play it. And I had an epiphany while I was watching people play this game. Because even though the game was abstract, people who were playing the game tried to interpret what was going on physically in the world based upon the way events were occurring, based upon different actions that they were taking in the game. And I was surprised by this. I was also surprised by the fact that when people were discussing the topics of the game, nobody was saying this is the best ideology, or nobody was trying to tell each other, well, this is what's right and this is what's wrong. Instead, each player was trying to understand the ideology that they had adopted for that game and trying to win with that ideology. And in doing so, they were trying to understand the system. And in understanding the system of that game, they began to understand more about those different ideologies and their influence upon the world. And I thought that was very fascinating. And I thought about, the educational value of what was going on here, that this wasn't a game like many educational games are. This wasn't Trivial Pursuit, the geopolitics version, which is going to teach you a bunch of facts and have you memorize those facts so that you could then relate those to people, or possibly have a professor interpret those facts for you so you know who is good and who is bad. Instead, without making those judgments, people were just, from the only motivation of wanting to win the game, immersing themselves in that world and trying to understand what was going on in that world without any extra motivation required. So I said to myself at that time, this is just an isolated thing, maybe it has to do with this game, but I felt it was a different way to approach people going up against a very complex subject and trying to understand it. I had a similar experience. One thing I wanted to point out as well is that part of what was interesting about that situation was that it wasn't just that people were playing a game, it's that they were playing a game and discussing it while they were playing. You can see these guys are here. That I think was an essential component of it, and that's something special about board games that we'll talk a little bit later. But there's something different about playing a game at your computer as opposed to sitting down at a table, playing a game and discussing it with one another. And this concept, which I started thinking about, was understanding through immersion, was not understanding through memorization or even through lecture or even just through discussion, but through immersing yourself in a subject in a way that only a game could make possible. And I Googled this term, because it's a term that I've been using for the past few years to see how else this term might be used. And interestingly, the most common use of understanding through immersion is used by people studying a foreign language who go to another country, because they want to not just study that language, but they want to immerse themselves in the world of that language so that they can understand that culture much better. So I felt that it was a good term also for our purposes, which was looking at games as a way of immersing yourself in a subject. I had about a year later, still before my first game had been published, because Ideology, even though I had designed it, didn't get published until 2003. In 2002, I was playing this video game. Does anybody know what this video game is? It's a real classic. It's not Civilization. No, it's Caesar 3 is the game, Caesar 3. And in Caesar 3, it's actually sort of a Roman version of the game Sim City. And in Sim City, you're building a city, and you're trying to keep the people happy in that city. And there's all kinds of systems that you have to try to understand in order to attract people to your city. So Caesar 3 was very similar to that game. So I was playing this game quite a bit in 2002. And my 5-year-old at the time, she's 16 now, my 5-year-old Sarah was spending some time with me while I played this game. And she wanted to watch, and it was very complicated for her, but she asked a lot of questions. You know, she wanted me to do well, and so I answered her questions. I was still learning the game myself. And so she started to understand and started actually giving me some advice, and I found that was interesting, that she had taken an interest in this very complicated game. And as the game progresses, it gets very dense, so that all that grass is gone and big buildings are built and so on. So I didn't think that much of it until another time I was playing the game, and I was in the living room on my laptop playing this game because I had gotten a little obsessed with the game. This is what game designers do as research. We play games. My daughter was coloring in her coloring book. And there are these advisors in the game, and these advisors tell you how you're doing and how the city is doing and what people think of you. And for the first time in the game, my advisor told me that the people loved me. You know, before they had been indifferent to me. Often they were grumbling because there was a lot of unemployment in my city. But for the first time, the people loved me. So I said, Sarah, the people love me. And she sat there coloring in her book, and without looking up, she said, well, raise taxes. And I said, that's a good idea. But I realized something. If I had sat down with my 5-year-old and said, I'm going to teach you about civics, and I'm going to teach you about how to manage a city and when you should raise taxes, that would not have gone over well. But there was something about her wanting me to win. That was the only motivation. You know, this lecture is about motivation. That was her only. She wanted Dad to win. She wanted him to do. She didn't like when I clicked on one of the school children and the school child said, I'm starving. You know, that was a sign that I wasn't doing things well in the city. So she said, Dad, you have to feed that person. Therefore, she allowed herself to become a part of that world and to analyze the system. And in doing so, she started to understand things. And so did I from playing this game about what it must take to run a city correctly. Sometimes you have to make decisions that aren't very popular. Or you have to use your popularity for the good of the city by maybe raising taxes so you can build, you know, better schools or more granaries so that that little child isn't starving. At this point, I really started to think about this, and I related it to what had happened with ideology, and this became something I started talking to people about quite a bit. And one of the keys about this topic that I think talks about game design and related to education is that when you look at Caesar 3, yes, you can learn a lot from that, but I was lucky that my daughter was there and we were being social and having a discussion. The difference between a video game and a board game or a card game, a game that you're playing on a table across from each other, as I mentioned a little bit before, is that you're social. You're talking to each other, and you're helping each other reach conclusions without necessarily trying to influence each other, but just kind of giving your point of view on exactly what it is that's going on. And I think that's one of the advantages to playing a game, a tabletop game. For teachers, if a teacher were to have tabletop games in their classroom and choose the right games that would help students become immersed in a particular subject. One of the other benefits of having people together playing a game together would be that the teacher could then join in the discussion without being in charge, without being the boss of the discussion, to sort of sit down and ask them what they were doing and why they were doing it. Because as you're asking a student why they're doing something in the game, you're really asking them why those people in that time period did that thing, or why somebody approaching that system would do that thing, because they're adopting that perspective in a way that would be difficult to do otherwise. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is we have sort of a challenge in the United States with board games. And the challenge is that, unlike, for example, in Europe, in the United States, board games have become sort of a naughty word. They're not anywhere near as popular as they were years ago. And one of the reasons for that is that the games that we play in the United States, in general, in the mass market, aren't really very good games. They're games like Monopoly, or Risk, or Stratego, which find a way to reinvent themselves by putting out a new version of themselves. So you'll find the Simpsons Monopoly, or the Harley-Davidson Monopoly. And it's easier. You then don't have to learn a new set of rules, because I already know how to play that game, except now I'm getting motorcycles instead of property in Atlantic City. That's a problem. Because then we have what I've found just from my own experiences is that many people, there's a lot of hardcore gamers out. How many of you would call yourselves a hardcore gamer by any chance? So therefore you're like, well, I don't play just Monopoly, I play all kinds of great games. But you're in the minority. A lot of people, they play Monopoly, they play Risk, they haven't played a lot. When I have students come into my game design class here at Rutgers and I ask them what board games they've played, I would say at least half of them have only played Monopoly and Risk, maybe Scrabble. Whereas if you go to Europe, there's a very, very different experience. There are board game cafes on the corners where people go, and families grow up playing 30 different types of games. And part of the reason why this is a problem is that not only are these games are there only a few different games, but these games have some pretty nasty things that happen during them. For example, there's a lot of cutthroat play. You're trying to ruin the other player. You're trying to land on boardwalk, then you'll suffer. You're trying to knock them out of the game. There's player elimination, where someone stops playing the game. They're not playing anymore. They have to go and do something else. The games are long. 4 hours of Risk when you know who's going to win after the first hour. The other 3 hours are torture as you watch that person gloat and spread that victory out as long as they can. There's a lot of luck-driven mechanics. There's a lot of roll the die and move and do what it tells you to do when you land there. And so a lot of people have not only a limited sense of games, but a lot of families adopt a very negative sense of games. I found this online. I thought it was very cute. But I mean, look at that picture, though. It's great because you win through causing hard feelings, because I'm taking what you have and what you've earned. European games are different. European games, in general, are about we're competing with each other. It's not everybody wins. Let me tell you, you play European games hardcore, you are trying to win that game. However, you're competing with me for something that I want, as opposed to something that I already have. And that has a very, very different effect on people psychologically. We're both competing for this resource. You got it first. Well, I'll have to take this one instead. As opposed to, I spent my hard-earned money building this, building this thing. Would you be able to get me a little water? Thanks. Building this thing, and now you're destroying it. You're taking it away. So let's look at a European game. This is a very famous European game. And the good news is these European games are starting to come over, which is great. There are some American publishers, Mayfair Games, Rio Grande Games, Z-Man Games. Thank you so much. And they are starting to bring these European games over. And the most famous game that was brought over to America in 1995, anybody know what this game is? The Settlers of Catan. And you can actually see this now if you go to Walmart. You'll be able to find Settlers of Catan, which is great. In Settlers of Catan, you're competing to build on this island, and the main form of interaction with each other is trading. you're trading with each other goods, and the goods don't have an absolute value. They have a value based upon what's going on in the game, what people want to build. Or nobody lives near the grain fields, so therefore grain has become very popular. So this is a way to teach students about supply and demand, to understand that things don't have a value just because somebody assigned them that value, but instead to teach them you trade with someone, so maybe wheat is more valuable, so I'll trade you wheat and you have to give me 2 or 3 things. So therefore I benefit from whatever it took me to get that wheat in that rare place on that island. So they're interacting with each other very heavily, but in a very different kind of way. Plus the game only takes an hour to an hour and a half, so you can sit down in a more reasonable amount of time and play the game. This is what we would call sort of a gateway game. Games that will bring you into other types of games. Now this game is a little more complicated. When you're going to try to find a game for your class, one of the things that you would have to realize is you'd have to research the game to make sure the game is approaching a particular subject in a certain way. So therefore, you would want a game that uses what we call in the industry top-down game design, as opposed to bottom-up game design. And top-down game design is where you look at a particular theme and you break that theme down into its component parts. So therefore, the game that people are experiencing is related directly to trying to understand that theme. So this is a very famous game, one of the most famous games among niche market gamers, called Puerto Rico. And this game is all about learning not only how to build a city and to acquire wealth, but also how to assign workers. So you have workers that are coming over to the New World on a colony ship coming over from Europe, and they are working in different buildings, and you have to realize that not only do you have to manage your money, but you have to understand labor allocation. So this is a very, very classic game, very, very famous game. There are other great European-style games that wouldn't be good for this situation. For example, a very famous game is Ticket to Ride. Ticket to Ride is a very famous board game, but it wouldn't help as much in the class because while it's a very fun game, great in many atmospheres, it doesn't really teach you about trains. It's not, if you were going to try to teach someone about how rail companies thrived, you wouldn't play Ticket to Ride. This is definitely a bottom-up game. Someone had a great idea for a mechanic and then sort of built a theme around it. So therefore, you would want to try to find a game where the theme is the center of the game. What I did was I put together a list of some different games that you might find interesting that are all kinds of different subjects, not only history, but economics, energy, and so on, just to give you some more examples of games that might be a kind of game that you would want to see in a classroom and have a professor, teaching students this sort of a game. So one of the games, for example, is this game, A Brief History of the World. What's wonderful about this game, this does have direct conflict, sort of like Risk. But what's very different about this game is that you begin about 10,000 BC and go all the way up into the 1900s. And you don't play the same empire the entire game. So you might be the Romans today, but you'll be the Celts tomorrow. So you play an empire for a certain period of time, and then that empire begins to diminish. And someone then takes on a new empire. And you'll actually still see your empire existing for hundreds of years, even though you're no longer controlling it. And what's fascinating about this game is that, once again, just from a desire to win the game, students can understand how different epochs happen in history and how what was great one day is swallowed up by another. And if you're a student of ancient history, one of the things that you know is that the existence of one empire actually facilitates the existence of the next empire, because it sort of builds over the old one. So that's one of the things that I thought was captured really nicely by this game, A Brief History of the World. This is a game completely different. This has become a very famous game lately. It's called Agricola. In Agricola, you're a farmer. And you're learning about farming, you're learning about agriculture, and you're actually bound. You have these awesome little pieces. You can have your little animals, and they're penned in there. That's your farm, and you have crops. And so you're kind of learning about how to manage crops, how to balance your farm. Your farm is of a limited size. So you have to figure out when you have to be able to feed your family, and yet you still have to have a surplus. so that you can acquire points at the end of the game. So the game becomes about how to manage your different resources during the course of the game and how to manage your own property. So this has become an extremely popular game. This is a game which I think is extremely poignant for today. It's called Power Grid. And in Power Grid, you are trying to create energy for a city. And what I really like about Power Grid is it approaches the issue of energy and renewable energy in a way that doesn't hit you on the head. It's one thing to tell a student about renewable energy and try to teach them about what types of energy would be better for our society. It's another thing to say, power this city and try to get the most points. And no particular energy type is lauded more than any other during the course of this game. But if you look, if you can see in the picture there, the different types of energy that are available. You know, you have your coal and you have oil. You have wind down there, but in the game, to be realistic, you know, wind requires the least amount of resources once it's up and running, but it's very expensive to get up and running. So it requires an investment for the long term. So what's great about Power Grid is students realize that there are certain short-term needs for the city, and they're all trying to power up the same city. There are certain short-term needs for the city, but then there's the long-term needs of the city. And eventually, fossil fuels and so on are going to start becoming very scarce in the city during a game of Power Grid. So it teaches students not by telling them this is what you should be doing and this is what our society should be doing, but instead it says try to win this game. Immerse yourself in this world. You're trying to get the most points. So therefore, you have to not just be thinking of things in the short term, but you have to be thinking of things in the long term. And I think it's one of the wonderful things that's accomplished by Power Grid without, you know, really talking at all in the rules of the game or in the victory conditions of the game about what would be best for that society. This is a game that we designed called Parthenon, Rise of the Aegean, and it actually has two purposes. It has sort of a historical purpose in that it talks about some of the struggles that Greeks would have had, say, in classical time in 600 BC. But it also teaches about risk management. In this game, unlike many other resource games, you don't have trouble acquiring resources. You actually get to acquire a lot of resources very quickly in this game. However, it's what you then do with those resources that becomes important. So you can ship those resources out, and that's very high risk. Or you could try to keep things home, but you'll grow at a very slower rate. So people who tend to load their ships up with lots of stuff, those boats start to sink, and they're miserable, and they get very emotionally attached to those ships when they sink. Believe me, I've demoed this game and had people curse me out during the course of the game because of what's happened to their boats. Because they sort of get that emotional investment. But they realize if they only think short term, if they only play it safe, other people are going to get ahead of them. So the game talks about risk, it teaches about risk management without ever talking about it. But the students kind of gain that understanding through playing the game. Another game that we've designed, which came out just this past year, is Canterbury. And if you look at this game, you can see actually the inspiration for this game is that game Caesar 3 that I had played 10 years earlier. That this is a board game that it puts everyone in charge of the same city. And so you're managing, there's water and food, and you have to manage resources that people need, religion, defense. Eventually you'll have stages, like in that one little place you'll see a stage. But in order to get to that point, you have to focus on the other services that are. You can't just build a stage in the middle of the wilderness and expect it to do well. People there need to be taken care of. So through the course of this game, you become very attached to this city. And unlike in the game Puerto Rico, you're all sort of building your own little town. In this game and in Power Grid, you're all actually building the same city. So you're sort of competing with each other for who can do the best for the people who live in this city. Once you've got your students playing games and becoming immersed in playing games, there's another step that you can go. And this is something that I've been experiencing directly through my teaching the last few years, is having your students make games. Once they've played some of these other games and they've started to understand a game does not have to be roll a die, move a certain number of spaces, and do what it says. That games are about choices and trying to win by different decisions that you're making. Then students can then learn a subject, and they'll learn far more about that subject from making the game than they will by playing the game, because now they have to do that top-down game design. They have to be able to take a subject and break it down into its most important parts. And that gives them a wholly new way of immersing themselves in a particular topic. So just to summarize the things that we've talked about, students sometimes absorb information without putting it into context. I'm not saying that that always happens. Of course, there are great ways through lectures and so on and through reading to be able to put things successfully into context. But sometimes taking notes, reading textbooks, listening to lectures doesn't give a student a full grasp on the entire system, because maybe they're not motivated to learn that system. They're only learning what they need to do to pass the final, to fill out that blue book. And therefore they're not as fully engaged with the system or the subject that it is that they're studying. Playing a game will allow you to analyze that system more deeply without any motivation required other than the need for victory. You want to win. People like to win. In order to win, they quickly discover they have to understand the system. They have to understand how they can exploit that system for victory. And doing so, they begin to grasp how and why things happened the way that they happened, or why and how they happened today the way that they're happening, as opposed to just who and what was involved. Games also create a social environment, and part of that social environment, particularly for tabletop games, is that they invite discussion. You're sitting across from someone at a table. You're looking them in the eye. Sometimes you might even be cursing them out because they just, built something where you wanted to build something. So that leads to a discussion. It also allows a professor or instructor to come in and join that discussion without taking charge of that discussion, and ask a student, why are you doing that? How is this helping you win the game? And finally, by being able to create a game, this is actually that other picture you saw of students making a game, and this picture are two pictures I just took yesterday in my class. These were students in my collaborative writing practices class who use game design as a tool. Gilliard Lopez and Raphael Kunin at gamasutra.com wrote an article about top-down game design, and I thought it was very interesting because they weren't talking about education in the article. And one of the things they said is that when working down from the top, the game designer usually exercises his analytical skills, i.e. his capacity of breaking a broader concept into smaller parts that are representative of the whole. And if that's what a game designer does, that's what we want students to do as well. Because when a student is explaining and then testing their game, and then evaluating their game, and inviting other players to immerse themselves into the worlds that they have constructed, it allows the designer and the player to grow in understanding of the subject, and to be able to discuss that subject in an entirely new way. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, yes.
What was that Harry Potter game you showed in the beginning?
We got to work on a Harry Potter game called Hogwarts House Cup Challenge.
Don't you think that the Time Turner is just way too OP?
You mean, have you played the game?
I have.
You have played the game, so it's very powerful. Yes, it lets you take an extra turn, right?
Yeah, it's
very nice. Thank you for that feedback.
Sure.
Yes.
Andrew, I have to assume that you get a copy of every new game that's launched.
Yes, of course,
okay?
absolutely.
So for a lot of different reasons. But how often do you see a new game and you say, this is a completely new paradigm?
Really?
I've never seen anything like this before. Or can you categorize every new game that comes out into some sort of something you've seen already?
That's a great question, because it does happen. It doesn't happen even every year. But there are games that come out that introduce a new type of a mechanic. So for example, there's a game that came out in 2008 called Dominion. And this game, Dominion, used a mechanic called deck building. And there had been a type of a game that had existed since 1993 called a collectible card game, where you sort of get cards like baseball cards. But instead you took the cards and you sort of built a deck out of them, and you'd spend hours doing this by yourself in your room. Then you'd find someone and challenge them to a duel, and you'd have this sort of duel together. So in 2008, someone said, let's make a game where the part where you're making the deck is the game. And so this was so now we're all sitting around the table building our different decks together, and it created a whole different way of thinking. Similarly, in 2005, there was a game called Caylus that came out, and it introduced a mechanic called worker placement. And in this game, it was more about, even more than Puerto Rico had been, about labor allocation, that there are these different places you can go, and when you get there first, no one else can go there. So you were deciding where in this city you were going to place your worker to get ahead of the other people. So this does happen. It doesn't happen that frequently, but when it does, you will see a whole series of games come out. Because one nice thing about certainly the board game community is that the designers embrace each other's work in a very big way. That when someone puts out a game, someone else will make a game that's inspired by that game and put that other designer in the special thanks, saying, thank you for designing this game. You led me to this place in my design. Yes?
So you think the motivation is to win. In the real world, a lot of my activities are not because I want to beat somebody. And in fact, I don't much like being put into a situation where I have to play that kind of game. Are there any games where somebody doesn't have to win?
Absolutely. Well, sort of. There are lots of games where either everybody wins or everybody loses. So these are called cooperative games.
Okay.
So there are games where you're working together against the game. So there are a lot of famous examples. One of them is a game called Shadows over Camelot, where you're trying to help King Arthur protect the kingdom versus outside forces that are coming in. So and what's interesting that you say even about a non-cooperative game, about in life that you're not always trying to defeat someone else. I think that for some of these games, especially the games that aren't like Monopoly or Risk, where you're trying to destroy someone else, a lot of the times you don't know who wins the game until the end. And everybody has a chance to win until the end, because really your desire to win comes from a desire to understand that system and to do well. And with some of these games, at the end, who won the game is trivial, because you were all trying to achieve victory points and there is different ways to win. And I think that's another thing that helps European-style games, certainly in family or educational settings, because that cutthroat feeling that I think that you're talking about doesn't have to exist in a game, even if that game is competitive. It doesn't have to be about wrecking the other guy. It's just, I took advantage of these opportunities a little bit better than you did. Yeah.
So logistically, in a teaching situation, how have you found that this really works? Because obviously, most board games are 4 or 5 players a pop, and so just from a pure logistics standpoint, how do you take advantage of this?
Well, what I've done for my classes is I've invested in some games. So when I first started teaching here at Rutgers, I went to Amazon and I bought a lot of different copies, because you could, with 20 students, 5 copies, you can play most games. So it was, and there are some places that if you're buying in bulk, you get free shipping and so on and so forth. So I basically, if you walk into my office right around the corner from my room, it's just filled with all of these games. And other professors who share that office, I always apologize. I'm like, I'm sorry I'm taking so much of the shelf space. They're like, oh, this is great. Are you kidding? I love coming in here and wondering what these games are about. So I invite them to, whenever they want to, play the games. But I feel like that is one of the downsides, is that you would indeed have to make that sort of investment. You could, depending upon how much the other costs are for the class, you could actually have students invest in a particular game. Maybe not every student would have to buy every game. You could assign students, you buy these 2 games, and that would be part of their budget for the classroom. Then they'd get to keep those games afterwards. But having the physical games is there, and sometimes people ask, well, it's great that you're immersing yourself in these worlds to understand these systems, but what about time for other things? We still need to have lectures, we still need to have other types of discussions. And one of the ways I respond is, this wouldn't be the only way that you would teach a class, but it would be a supplement. Think of people watching a movie or a documentary in order to supplement their teaching. They could do this instead.
Yeah, also to that and to what Chuck was saying, is a game Pandemic, where you're playing roles of a team going in to fight, a virus at a global level sort of thing, and that gives you the cooperation components. You're trying to as a group win, cure.
And that's probably become one of the most famous cooperative games, Pandemic. And what's interesting about Pandemic in particular is that in Pandemic, you're all on the same team, but you all have different talents. So each of you has a different skill. Some of you are better at treating victims of the illness. Some of you are better at researching ways to come up with a vaccine for the illness. And you have to coordinate your activities together. And the game is brutal. It is hard to win that game. And so you have to really work together, and there's a tremendous amount of discussion that takes place during the game.
I'd say there are also a couple of cooperative games that are more designed around the narrative. There's a bunch of storytelling ones now, where basically each person gets a noun or an adjective or something like that, and they have to work that into the story. So everybody's building basically a giant story together. So that doesn't even have any winner at all, if you're trying to avoid the whole winning-losing kind of thing. So there are other games out there. They're not as popular, but they are interesting and stuff. And actually, now that there's kind of been a resurgence of board games in the last decade or so, since Settlers basically got brought over here in '95. So there's a lot more experimental things happening. There's all kinds of Kickstarters for try my narrative board game kind of thing, and people are just publishing these games that what used to cost tens of thousands now cost them $3,000 because all you just print it on demand, and people get a copy in their house for $12. So there's all kinds of neat stuff like that out there if you're looking for something.
Yeah, I mean, what defines what a game is has changed so much in a good way. In fact, in the tabletop industry, even though, if you think of the video game industry, okay, if the video game industry was the size of this room, then the tabletop game industry is the size of this iPad. It's nowhere even in the same league or category. But what's amazing is that it's an industry that's growing, and it's intersecting in many ways with the video game industry, because many of these European-style board games are now on the iPad or they're on Android devices. So that will help people, I think, learn these types of mechanics much more. I still don't think there's a substitute for sitting there and having that social interaction face-to-face, but as far as becoming versed in mechanics and understanding how these different games work, certainly Settlers of Catan, Ticket to Ride, Puerto Rico, these other games, you can download them for $3 or $4 on your iPad and really get to understand that sort of a game. Yep.
I was going to ask you, in general, it'll be difficult to find a game that fits the class I'm teaching next semester. Like, you are not going to be that lucky. You might be lucky once.
Right.
But other than that, have you attempted, I know you make games anyway, but have you tried to tailor a game, to shape a game, to change the rules of a game, to apply it to a class, and to try to fit better what you're trying to teach? And how successful do you think one can be with basic knowledge of other board games? Not saying starting from blank,
Right.
but you know other board games. Do you think it would be recommendable? Have you tried that?
I haven't done it because in the classes that I teach, the students are basically choosing a topic and creating a game from it. But if you had a particular subject, I think that if there wasn't a game, if you couldn't, a lot of people think that a lot of these games for education would be mostly historical games like A History of the World. But that's why I showed Power Grid and the others, to show that there are games that deal with a lot of other interesting, very poignant contemporary topics. But if you couldn't find a game that fit that topic, then I think that what would be interesting would be to have students play a game that would be similar to that theme, and then perhaps to have them modify the game to create, in video games, there's this whole big thing called modding. Video games have become not just about the publisher anymore. When a video game is published now, it's almost expected that it will come with tools that allow the players to change the game to fit the way they want to play the game. So I think it might be interesting, rather than have a student in a particular subject have to completely create a game from scratch, to maybe take a game and to be able to modify that game to fit your subject. I was contacted a couple of years ago by someone at Princeton University who they had a sustainability program at Princeton, and they had students taking Settlers of Catan and altering the rules in order to have more of a theme about sustainable energy. And so they asked me to come and just to sort of evaluate the game for them and to look at it. And it was interesting. It was an interesting subject, but that's why I thought of this so quickly, because I feel like that would be a great way to allow students, without having to create a whole new game, without having that experience, to have the professor choose a game that's close and have them make the modifications. And then they'll really feel like they own that system and want to understand that system completely.
Great.
Any other questions? Yes?
As a follow-up for that question, if you go looking online, there are actually a lot of professor-built games out there. I've seen a lot of economic ones and again, sustainable energy stuff, things along those lines. Not everything's covered, of course, and not everything is available. Some people, they want to hold it so that's their own thing. We were also approached briefly about looking into a Tragedy of the Commons game, basically to explain the idea of that. And that actually I think would translate very easily into a game. Basically, if everybody's coming out of the same pool and suddenly empty, that's kind of makes the point pretty quickly. So it wouldn't be that hard to develop things. The difference is the game designer will bring the expertise of the game design, but they might not know your subject at all. So they need to understand. You'll need to bring them up to speed enough that they can help you build a game that makes sense, kind of thing. Or you can just go to them and ask them for some basic ideas about game design and ask them to lead you with your ideas. So it's going to have to be a collaborative effort, basically.
Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate it. If anyone did have anything else that they wanted to ask me privately, I'll be here for a little while, so please feel free.